a German patrol officer reads a proclamation nailed to the door of a taverna in a mountain village, and every villager standing in the square already knows what the last line means before he finishes reading it. For 4 years of occupation, the German command in Crete operated on one unshakable rule: fear would buy obedience. Reprisal killings, burned villages, and public executions were not incidental brutality. They were policy, calculated, and deliberate, designed to make the cost of resistance so catastrophic that ordinary people would choose silence over defiance every single time. Every occupying army in history has relied on some version of this same math. Threaten enough, kill enough, and the population will police itself out of fear of what helping the enemy might cost them and everyone they love. In Crete, German command didn't merely threaten this policy, they carried it out, repeatedly, in full view of the population, specifically so no village could claim ignorance of the price. Crete met that rule with a population that did the math differently. This is the story of the Cretan villages that spent years hiding, feeding, and protecting Allied soldiers stranded on the island after the German invasion, full well knowing that the penalty for being caught was not a fine, not a prison sentence, but death, and often the destruction of the entire village along with it. At the center of that story is one New Zealand soldier who should have died within weeks of his capture, and instead survived for nearly 3 years behind German lines, kept alive entirely by strangers who owed him nothing and risked everything. Dudley Perkins was born on February 23, 1915, in Christchurch, New Zealand, the son of a clergyman, Reverend John Perkins, and his wife, Adelaide. There was nothing in his upbringing that marked him out as a future guerrilla commander. He was raised in a quiet, devout household in Canterbury, the kind of upbringing that produced schoolteachers and ministers, not partisan leaders. He enlisted in the New Zealand military in September 1939, within days of Britain's declaration of war, one of tens of thousands of young men across New Zealand answering the call at the very start of the conflict, and was shipped out to Egypt as part of the broader Commonwealth mobilization building up in the Mediterranean theater. In early 1941, Perkins, serving as a staff sergeant with the 4th Field Regiment of the New Zealand Artillery, was dispatched to Greece as part of the doomed Allied effort to help defend the country against the German invasion. Commonwealth troops, alongside Greek forces already exhausted from months of fighting off the earlier Italian invasion, tried to hold a defensive line against a German force with overwhelming air superiority and armor. It didn't work. Within weeks, the Greek mainland campaign collapsed, and Commonwealth forces were evacuated, many of them to Crete, where Allied commanders hoped the island's mountainous terrain and limited access points might allow a final stand. It didn't hold either. The German airborne invasion of Crete, launched on May 20, 1941, and codenamed Operation Mercury, was the largest airborne assault attempted up to that point in the history of warfare. Roughly 750 glider-borne troops, 10,000 paratroopers, and 7,000 seaborne troops thrown at an island defended by exhausted Commonwealth and Greek forces with limited heavy weapons and no meaningful air cover of their own. The critical battleground of the invasion's opening hours was Vasilei airfield on the island's northwest coast, the single airstrip German command needed to secure before reinforcements and heavy equipment could be flown in. New Zealand troops, Perkins's own countrymen, serving in the New Zealand division, held the high ground overlooking Vasilei in the invasion's first day, inflicting devastating losses on the German paratroopers, dropping directly into their defensive positions, Confusion in the New Zealand chain of command that first night led to the airfield's defenders withdrawing from a key hill overlooking the strip, allowing German forces to seize Maleme early the following morning. A single tactical decision that historians have long identified as the turning point of the entire battle, since it allowed Germany to begin flying in the 5th Mountain Division, a formation that would ultimately commit close to 14,000 additional troops to the island, tipping a battle that had for one night hung in the balance. The fighting was ferocious, and it was not confined to soldiers. For the first time in the war, German forces encountered mass, spontaneous resistance from an armed civilian population. Farmers, shepherds, old men and women picking up whatever weapons they could find, from ancient hunting rifles to captured German equipment, and fighting alongside the retreating Commonwealth troops. German paratroopers, dropping into concentrated fire from Commonwealth defenders and civilians alike, suffered catastrophic and unexpected casualties in the opening days. Losses so severe that German high command would later restrict large-scale airborne operations for the remainder of the war, based on what happened over Crete. But numbers, air superiority, and momentum eventually told. Within roughly 10 days, Crete's defenders were overwhelmed, and the island fell. The German High Command's reaction to that unexpected civilian resistance was immediate and merciless. Days after the surrender, the temporary German commander of the island, General Kurt Student, issued direct orders for a wave of reprisal actions against the Cretan population, citing reports, many later found to be exaggerated or false, that civilians had mutilated German dead. On June 3, 1941, barely a week after the fighting ended, German forces entered the village of Kandanos in western Crete, whose residents had helped hold up the German advance toward the town of Paliakora for 2 days during the invasion. Roughly 180 men from the village were rounded up and executed, while women and children were expelled from Kandanos before the killing and burning began. Every house was burned to the ground. Signs were erected at every road leading into the ruins, in German and in Greek, stating that Kandanos had been destroyed in retribution for the killing of German soldiers and would never be rebuilt. Nearby villages, including Floria and Kakopetro, suffered the same fate in the same wave of reprisals. This was the reality every villager in Crete lived with for the rest of the occupation. Not a hypothetical threat printed on a proclamation, but a demonstrated, carried-out policy, less than 2 weeks old by the time the German occupation formally began. Every Cretan who chose, afterward, to hide an escaped Allied soldier or feed him or warn him of an approaching patrol made that choice with the ashes of Kandanos as the explicit publicly displayed example of exactly what German command was willing to do. When Crete fell, Commonwealth soldiers were captured in the chaos of the collapse. Men who had been fighting a defensive campaign for weeks, exhausted, low on ammunition, with no evacuation route left, once the German advance cut off the southern ports. Perkins was among them. One name in a mass of roughly 12,000 Commonwealth prisoners taken across the island as German forces consolidated control in the campaign's final days. For most of those men, capture meant the war was over. A prisoner of war camp, and if they survived the conditions, liberation years later, when the war finally ended. Perkins had other plans. Within a matter of weeks of his capture, he escaped, slipping away from a hastily organized column of prisoners being marched toward a holding camp, into terrain he barely knew, on an island now under full German military occupation, an occupation that had already, in its first days, shown exactly what it was willing to do to anyone who defied it. What followed was not a quick dash to safety. Crete, in the summer of 1941, was an island under total German control. Its coastline watched for evacuation attempts, its main roads patrolled, its towns subject to searches, curfews, and a growing network of informants working for or coerced by the occupying force. An escaped Commonwealth soldier had nowhere obvious to go and no safe, fast way to get there. Perkins spent the better part of the next year moving through the mountains and remote villages of western Crete, the rugged Kissamos region, the harsh broken country behind Malema airfield, where some of the fiercest fighting of the invasion had taken place, terrain of steep gorges, terraced olive groves, and isolated hill villages that had barely changed in generations. He survived, by his own later account, and by the accounts of those who knew him during this period, on foraged food, snails gathered from stone walls, dandelion roots dug from hillsides, and on whatever the villagers he encountered were willing to share, at a time when food itself was scarce under occupation rationing, and every mouth fed was a mouth taken from a family's own dwindling supply. What Perkins discovered during that year of hiding was not incidental hospitality, offered once and forgotten. It was something closer to an entire underground network, operating quietly across dozens of villages that had no formal command structure connecting them, no central organization, and in many cases, no direct communication with each other at all, just a shared, unspoken understanding that a hunted man deserved protection, whatever the cost of providing it, and whatever example German command had already made of villages that resisted. Villagers fed him. They hid him in barns, in shepherds' huts in the high country, in the back rooms of homes during German search sweeps. They warned him, through whatever means of passing word existed in a rural, occupied community. When patrols were approaching a village he was sheltering near, and they asked for almost nothing in return. Beyond occasionally his help, a foreign soldier with military training, willing to fight alongside them against the army occupying their island. By the time Perkins was finally evacuated off Crete, smuggled out by a Greek submarine after roughly a year on the run, he had a choice most men in his position would not have made. He was offered the option to return home to New Zealand, to take officer training, to put Crete behind him with his service record intact and his war, for all practical purposes, honorably over. He refused. What he had seen of the Cretan resistance during that year, and what ordinary villagers had risked over and over to keep a stranger alive, had changed something fundamental in his understanding of what this war actually required of him. He volunteered instead for the British Special Operations Executive, the organization running Britain's clandestine resistance and sabotage operations across occupied Europe, specifically so he could go back to the island and the people who had saved his life. You return to an island that has learned to live under a death sentence, and you go back not as a fugitive hiding from an occupying army, but as a man about to lead an armed resistance against it. By the time Perkins comes back to Crete as an SOE special agent, he is joining a resistance network that has by necessity become highly organized despite operating with no fixed headquarters, no uniforms, and no safe rear area anywhere on the island. British coordination of the Cretan resistance ran through a small number of SOE officers embedded on the ground. Men like Tom Dunbabin, who served for years as the senior British liaison officer, moving between resistance bands across the island, and Zan Fielding, operating in the west alongside Perkins' own area of operations. None of them could have functioned for more than a few weeks without the Cretan runners who carried messages on foot across mountain trails, German patrols could not fully cover. Men like George Psychondakis, a young Cretan shepherd who spent years as a courier for the resistance, moving between British agents and Cretan bands on foot, sometimes covering more than 40 miles of mountain terrain in a single night, memorizing messages rather than risking written notes that could be found in a search. Psychondakis would later publish his own memoir of those years, one of the only first-hand Cretan accounts of the resistance to reach a wide readership after the war. German reprisal policy on the island has hardened into something close to systematic doctrine by this point, and Kandanos is no longer the only example burned into local memory. Villages across the island, Kondomari, and later in 1943, a cluster of villages in the Vianos region in the east, face similar mass reprisal actions during the occupation. Entire communities punished collectively for real or suspected resistance activity. This was not rumor or exaggeration, circulated after the war to inflate the resistance's suffering. It was documented occupation policy, consistent with German reprisal doctrine, applied with brutal consistency across occupied Europe. And in Crete, it was enforced with particular severity precisely because the island's resistance activity never stopped, year after year, despite every attempt to break it through fear. Perkins does not operate as a lone agent, moving quietly through the shadows, avoiding contact, minimizing risk. He does something more dangerous, and in the context of the island's occupation, something far more remarkable. He assembles and commands his own guerrilla band, made up largely of Cretan fighters who choose to follow a foreign soldier into direct, sustained combat against the force occupying their homeland. He leads them in attacks against German installations, patrols, and supply routes across western Crete. To the British command structure he technically reports to, he remains simply Kiwi. But to the Cretans fighting beside him, sheltering him, and feeding his men on what little food their villages could spare, he becomes known by a name chosen deliberately, so that a German patrol circulating a description of an escaped New Zealand soldier would not connect it to the resistance leader terrorizing their occupation forces. Vasilei, Kapetan Vasili, Captain Vasili. By 1943, Perkins commands hundreds of partisans across western Crete, coordinating attacks, sabotage operations, and intelligence gathering against an occupying force that by now understands exactly who Vasili is, even without knowing his real name, his real nationality, or where precisely he is hiding on any given night. German command wants him captured or killed as badly as it wants any resistance leader operating on the island, and every intelligence report, every captured informant, every interrogation conducted in the hunt for Vasili represents a direct threat to every village that has ever sheltered him. Every one of those villages is making, again and again, the same calculation the villagers made 2 years earlier when Perkins was an escaped prisoner hiding in the hills with nothing to offer but gratitude. Except now, the stakes have escalated dramatically because Perkins is no longer a fugitive trying quietly to survive. He is an active combatant, leading armed operations against German forces, and any village connected to his network is not a peripheral risk to German command. It is a direct, active target for reprisal, with Kandanos standing as the standing, publicly displayed proof of exactly what that reprisal could mean. The danger is not abstract, and it is not occasional. German patrols sweep repeatedly through the countryside of western Crete, specifically hunting Cretan resistance leaders and the Allied agents operating alongside them, and villages suspected of assisting the resistance pay a price that goes far beyond arrests or fines. Homes are burned to the ground. Men are executed, sometimes in the village square itself. In front of the wives, children, and neighbors, The German command intends as witnesses, so the lesson of what resistance costs cannot be misunderstood by anyone watching. It does not work the way German command intends it to. In one documented episode from this period, 13 German soldiers are caught stealing sheep from a flock near one of the villages within Perkins' operational area. What follows is not a negotiation, not a warning shot fired to scare off looters. A firefight breaks out between Perkins's band and the German patrol. Sudden, close range, the kind of engagement where there is no time to plan and no room to retreat cleanly. In the exchange of fire, Perkins is wounded. A bullet strikes dangerously close to his kidney, an injury that, in occupied, resource-starved Crete, carries a very real risk of death from internal bleeding or infection alone. Without access to a hospital, without proper surgical supplies, entirely dependent on whatever crude field care the resistance network and sympathetic villagers can improvise for him in hiding, in a barn or a shepherd's hut, with German patrols actively searching the surrounding hills for the man who just killed their comrades. He survives. There is no dramatic account of exactly how, no named surgeon, no field hospital, nothing invented to fill the gap in the record. What the documented history tells us is simpler and in some ways more remarkable. He survives a serious gunshot wound while hiding from an active manhunt on an island with almost no medical infrastructure available to him and returns to command his men. He continues fighting. Through the remainder of 1943 and into early 1944, Perkins's guerrilla band continues operating across western Crete, striking German positions, disrupting supply lines, feeding German garrisons on the island, and gathering intelligence that flows back through the resistance network, carried on foot by runners like Psychondakis across mountain trails to Allied command in the Middle East. Every single one of those operations depends, at every step, on villagers willing to risk execution for hiding fighters overnight, for passing a warning about troop movements down a mountain trail, for simply staying silent under interrogation when a German officer demands to know where Vasilei's band moved through 3 nights earlier. The German command's reprisal policy escalates in direct response to the resistance's persistence, not in spite of it. Across occupied Crete during this period, villages are burned and Cretans are executed in the ongoing hunt for resistance leaders, a documented sustained campaign of collective punishment that never breaks the network Perkins depends on, because the villagers sheltering him are not making a single, one-time act of courage. They are making the same choice over and over, month after month, year after year, with the threat of execution never lifted and never forgotten, and choosing, every time, to make it again. On February 25, 1944, 2 days after his 29th birthday, a German patrol finds Perkins in the hills near Lakoi in western Crete, in an ambush. Local Cretan accounts and his memorial place, more precisely near Tsikalaria, close to Stefanoporo. In the encounter that follows, he is killed. He had been recommended for the Victoria Cross and separately for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, 2 of the British Commonwealth's highest awards for gallantry in the face of the enemy. Both recommendations failed for the same procedural reason. His actions in the field had not been directly witnessed by a British officer. There was no British command structure standing over Perkins' war, watching and verifying for the official record. There were only the Cretan fighters beside him in every engagement, and the villagers who kept him alive for nearly 3 years. And in the strict military bureaucracy that decided who received Britain's highest honours, their testimony did not count as sufficient witness. He was posthumously mentioned in dispatches instead. official recognition, but a fraction of what his actions, by every account of the men who fought beside him, actually earned. Somewhere, there's a family whose grandfather was in this story. Maybe they know, maybe they don't. These videos find those families sometimes, a grandchild watching, recognizing a name, understanding for the first time what their family member actually went through. That's worth a subscribe. What German occupation authorities in Crete never fully grasped, despite years of trying to break the island's resistance through fear, was that their own reprisal policy was failing at the one thing it was designed to achieve. Executions and village burnings did not isolate resistance fighters from the surrounding population. They did not deter villagers from sheltering escaped Allied soldiers or agents like Perkins. If anything, the shared danger and the shared cost when reprisals fell on a village bound the resistance network and the civilian population of Western Crete more tightly together with every passing year of occupation, not less. The strategic value of what Perkins and the villagers supporting him accomplished extended well beyond his own band's direct attacks on German forces. The intelligence his network fed back to Allied command in the Middle East contributed to the broader Allied picture of German troop dispositions and activity on Crete throughout the occupation, information that mattered for wider Mediterranean strategic planning. At a time when Crete's position made it significant to both sides for controlling access to the eastern Mediterranean and the approaches to North Africa. The sustained resistance activity across the island also tied down substantial German occupation forces on Crete that could otherwise have been redeployed to other, more active fronts, a strategic cost to the German war effort that compounded year over year. Every year, the island refused to fully submit to occupation. Perkins was not the only Allied soldier surviving on the courage of Cretan villagers during this period, and he was not operating in isolation from the wider Cretan resistance movement. Other escaped Commonwealth soldiers, including Staff Sergeant Tom Moyer, returned to Crete alongside Perkins as part of the same Special Operations Executive Network. Depending on the same villages, the same web of quiet, repeated defiance to survive and operate behind German lines. British agents, including Patrick Leigh Fermor and others, worked within this same resistance ecosystem, an ecosystem that existed at all only because ordinary Cretans across dozens of villages with no central coordination kept independently arriving at the same conclusion, that hiding these men was worth the risk, whatever German command threatened. That same resistance network, built on the exact same villages and the exact same willingness to risk everything for Allied operatives, would go on to carry out one of the most audacious special operations of the entire Cretan campaign just weeks after Perkins's death. In April 1944, Patrick Leigh Fermor and fellow SOE officer William Stanley Moss, working with Cretan resistance fighters, kidnapped the German commander of the Crete garrison, General Heinrich Kreiper, off the island entirely, smuggling him through the same mountains, past the same German patrols, and relying on the same villages that had spent 3 years hiding men like Vasilei. It succeeded for the same reason Perkins had survived nearly 3 years behind enemy lines, a population that had already decided, since the ashes of Kandanos in June 1941, exactly what it was willing to risk. Perkins' own closest companion during much of his time in the field, a young Cretan named Michael Cyradakis, fought alongside him through much of the guerrilla campaign, one of countless Cretan fighters whose names rarely appear in the official Allied record of the war, but without whom Vasilei's resistance band could not have operated a single day. Dudley Perkins is buried at Suda Bay War Cemetery on Crete, among thousands of other Commonwealth dead from the battle and occupation of the island. His story did not fade quietly into a casualty list, the way so many individual acts of wartime courage do. Cretans who fought alongside him and villagers who sheltered him kept his memory alive for decades after the war ended, passing the story of Kapetan Vasili down through their own families long before it was ever written into a book. Murray Eliot's account, Vasilei, the Lion of Crete, published in 1987, was built on years of research, including direct interviews with Cretan resistance fighters and Perkins' own SOE colleagues, preserving first-hand testimony while those witnesses were still alive to give it. The village of Kandanos itself outlasted the vow carved into the German signage at its edge. Forbidden from rebuilding for years, its surviving residents eventually returned, and today Kandanos stands again, a modern village of around 1,000 people, built back on the ground German command declared would remain empty forever. The rebuilding of Kandanos stands as its own quiet answer to the same question the villagers sheltering Dudley Perkins were answering year after year at enormous risk, whether fear could permanently break a population that had already decided what it valued more than its own safety. In 2001, New Zealand's Prime Minister Helen Clark travelled to Crete alongside Perkins' own brother, Neville, to lay a wreath at the plaque honouring him, nearly 60 years after his death, a head of government from the other side of the world, standing in a Cretan village to mark what one soldier and the people who protected him had done. The villagers that hid Dudley Perkins never received official recognition on the scale of a Victoria Cross, and most of the individual villagers who fed him, warned him, and risked execution for him were never named in any citation, never received a medal, and in many cases, their names survive today only in the oral history passed down within their own families and communities. Grandmothers telling grandchildren about the winter they hid a foreign soldier in the goat shed, fathers telling sons which hillside path was used to warn Vasilei's band that a patrol was coming. What they did required no rank, no formal training, and no weapon of their own, only a decision, made and remade for nearly 3 years under a standing threat of death, that a stranger's survival was worth more than their own safety. If you felt the weight of this story, that's history doing what it's supposed to do. That like button honors that feeling. We carry these stories carefully, every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Better yet, what forgotten story from your nation deserves this treatment? We might cover it. We read every suggestion. Thank you for carrying the weight of Dudley Perkins' story forward. He carried something heavier. The least we can do is remember it.